Welcome to Casual Friday. Hi, I'm Roxanne Richardson, and this is my weekly Casual Friday podcast. If you'd like to jump right to a specific point in the video, you can tap or mouse over the video playback area of the screen to reveal the chapter titles and starting points of each section. In this week's podcast, I have tidbits. I have two projects that I finished at the very end of the year and a new project that I'm getting started at the beginning of this year. And I have some tips for reducing your UFO pile without having to knit a stitch. So let's get started. This first tidbit came to me from Regia, also known as Empress of Yarn. She said that on December 24th, the CBC radio, that's Canadian radio, the program Spark had a section which included talking about Morse code. The interview was with Kristen Herring, who used knitting and Morse code as illustrations of binary code. So if you are interested in listening to the Spark episode where they talked about this, I'm going to leave a link down below. And Regia says that the interview with Kristen Herring begins at the 25-minute point. And there's also an older presentation by Kristen Herring on this topic, which is in a YouTube video, which I will also leave a link to. So thank you very much, Regia, for those links. Anyone who's been watching my Casual Friday podcast for more than 10 minutes will know that I have been working on this long-term project to knit a sweater from each decade between the 1890s and 1990s. I've been working on this for about 3 years. So the purpose of this long-term project is to understand the evolution of the hand-knit sweater in terms of the purpose of sweaters, the way that they are constructed, the materials and tools that are being used, and how the patterns are presented to the knitter. So all of these things changed over the course of those 100 years. Well, one of the things that changed was materials that knitters were using as well as the tools. In last week's Casual Friday, I posted a compilation video of tidbits from 2021 that had to do with textile history. And in one of those tidbits, I was flipping through this book right here from the 1950s. And two people commented about the knitting needles that were called for in some of these patterns. They were labeled as non-inflammable knitting needles. And so there was a little confusion about what that term means. So the word inflammable means exactly the same as flammable. Inflammable comes from the word inflame, but it can be very confusing to people because the prefix in, like inconceivable or inconsiderate, usually means the opposite of whatever the word is that comes after that. And so many people misinterpreted the word inflammable to mean not flammable. And so firefighters began this campaign in the early part of the 20th century, like in the 1920s to 30s, to use the term flammable instead of inflammable, and then to use non-flammable when you meant something would not catch on fire. But the term inflammable continued to be used for a long time, and you can see that in this particular book. So what they're actually calling for in this book are plastic knitting needles that aren't going to catch fire. And the reason they would specify that is that one of the early plastics that was used in the 20th century was celluloid, and that was used for films in the movie making industry, and it was known to catch fire very quickly. And so what they are warning against is, using celluloid knitting needles. Don't use those. Use something that isn't going to catch on fire as you're knitting. So you'll also notice that as part of that pattern, the materials that were being called for, the yarn that was being called for was Germantown yarn, which was a yarn that had been used for at least 100 years here in the US, except this was a Germantown yarn that was a blend of wool and nylon. So you start seeing a lot of synthetic fibers coming in after World War II as well. So So this is one of the things that I'm looking at in this long-term project is the fact that materials, like the types of yarns that are being called for and the fibers that are being called for, are changing over the course of the century, and also the tools change as well. This tidbit showed up in a couple of my feeds, I think my Instagram feed and my Twitter feed, in about mid-December. I was seeing it repeatedly, and it's a book and people were raving about the book. So I bought it. It sounded really interesting to me. It's called This Long Thread, and it's by Jen Hewitt. I'll just read you a little bit about kind of what the premise of the book is. Weaving together interviews, first-person essays, and artist profiles, This Long Thread explores the work and contributions of people of color across the fiber arts and crafts community, representing a wide spectrum of race, age, region, cultural identity, education, and economic class. These conversations explore techniques and materials, belonging, identity, pride of place, cultural misappropriation, privilege, the value or undervaluing of craft, community support structures, recognition or exclusion, intergenerational dialogue, and much more. The author is Jen Hewitt. And what she did was she put a survey out, and I think she got close to 300 responses. She asked people to write essays, and she interviewed some people to write these profiles for this book. And they're kind of intermixed together. It is fascinating. I started reading it in the bathtub last week. One of the interviews that appears close to the beginning of the book is with a woman named Sonia Phillip. Now, her name did not ring a bell with me at all, and it turns out she sews and she writes sewing patterns. Well, I sew, but I really don't follow what's going on in the sewing world. I just started sewing again last year. But as I started reading the interview, Jen Hewitt, the person who was doing the interview of Sonia, mentioned the 100 Acts of Sewing project, and that I had heard of. And the more I read this interview, the more I just felt like I understood where Sonia was coming from. The way she was talking about sewing is the way that I feel about knitting. And she did this year-long project where she sewed 100 dresses in 1 year, and she just immersed herself in sewing and learning and figuring so much of it out and really understanding what was going on. And she now has sewing patterns. She does tutorials. She's got a website, which I will link to down below, and you can learn more about the 100actsofsewing.com is the name of it, and I'll leave a link below. This is a fascinating book, and it's just it covers so many different textile artists and people who just craft as a hobby, people who are doing it as a business, people who are doing traditional crafts. There's a young woman who lives on a Navajo reservation, and she is weaving these traditional rugs, but she's not using machine milled yarn the way the other weavers are these days. She's using the really traditional method of using hand spun, using the wool from her grandmother's sheep. So I really encourage you to get a copy of this book in some way, either buy it or check it out from the library. It's really fascinating. This tidbit came to me in my Twitter feed. Somebody had come into possession of some vintage embroidery kits that were labeled, they were manufactured by the Penelope Company, which is a UK company, and they were labeled that they were for His Majesty's forces and they were not for resale. And they got a response from a museum who knew quite a bit about these embroidery kits. They dated back to World War I. They were designed to be used by soldiers who were in the hospital and who were recovering from injuries. And so it was a form of occupational therapy for them to be working on this needlepoint. It was also a bit of physical therapy for people who had had trauma to their hands, for example. This kind of activity using needlework, needle crafts, as a form of occupational or physical therapy for soldiers was not unique to World War I. This blog post goes on to talk about how even in World War II they were doing these kinds of things and also teaching soldiers to knit and crochet. These particular examples were focusing on events in the UK, but they also talked about that in the US, Civil War soldiers were doing this kind of thing as well. Were known to be doing things like quilting and knitting as they were recovering in hospitals. So I'm going to leave a link down in the show notes to that blog post because I found that really interesting. There's quite a few photographs of soldiers with their needlework, either displaying it or just being shown working on it. This last tidbit, I did not write down who sent it. This was sent to me in, I believe, either a direct message or as a post in my Ravelry group. I really apologize to whoever sent this link. It's called One Button a Week. There is a website that goes along with it. There's a woman named Gina. Her business is called Gina B Silk Works. So she has got a website, a separate website aside from this challenge, and she's got a YouTube channel. And so she has come up with a set of prompts for each week of the year if you would like to make buttons. And so these are buttons that will use button forms and different kinds of thread, but she's inviting people to make buttons in whatever kinds of materials speak to them. But the goal is to create something that could actually be used as a clothing fastener. I will leave links down in the show notes to Gina's YouTube video, the first video in the series for the Button of a Week, as well as to the website where you can see what the prompts are, and also to her website where she does all kinds of work for as a costumer or as a consultant to TV and film. So she makes all kinds of historical button types of things for that and purpose, but she also sells all of the materials that you might want to use if you wanted to make your own buttons. I spent the last couple of weeks in December knitting a totally complete pair of socks for my brother, as well as completing a pair of socks that I had started back in January. So I'm going to go to the overhead and give you a little tour through both pairs of socks. These are the socks I knit for my brother. I did knit these cuff down for him. I used a style of peasant heel that's actually called a plain heel. So when I finished knitting the leg, I went right into knitting this style of heel, which is done in the round toward that direction. When I get the length of the leg that I wanted, first of all, I knew that I would need a few more stitches. I've knit socks for him before, I know this. So I created a little bit of a gusset. So I just increased 2 stitches, 1 on each side of the back of the leg. And then I knit a plain round, and then I did another increase in a plain round. And then I was ready to start the heel. So what you do with a plain heel is you put the instep stitches on waste yarn. So you're putting those to the side. And these are all still on the needle. You work across those stitches, and then you do a provisional cast on around this way, and you can join in the round, and so you can work this heel in the round all the way. I chose to separate the decreases along this decrease line. I haven't done it that way in a long time. I did it on a whim. You can do other ways of doing your decreases, it's fine. So you pick up the stitches that are on waste yarn, you put those back on the needle, and then you remove the provisional cast on and capture those live stitches. And I didn't need to do a gusset for the foot. His foot's quite a bit bigger than his leg, so I didn't need to decrease out stitches down to the original stitch count because he just needs more stitches for the foot. And then, that's what I did. I knit a toe to match his heel. So it's a standard wedge toe. Because his foot is so big around, but his toes are relatively short, I modify the sock toe, in order to fit his foot better. So I start the decreases at the base of his toes, but I work the rate faster in order to get them done sooner so that the sock toe will be done by the time I get to the end of his toes. So I have a few of them where I'm doing them every other round, and then I do them every round. I have a video on that too, how you can adjust the length of your sock toes based on the length that you actually need for that person's foot. Now, originally I had intended to knit a heel with a spiral heel. So I've been doing spiral toes recently, and I have been experimenting with using that toe as a type of plain heel or peasant heel as well. But I wasn't really sure how to make those calculations. I figured out how to do it for a foot that fits me. And so my brother's foot is proportioned very differently. And I wanted to use that heel in this sock, but I wasn't sure it was actually going to fit. So what I did was I used a heel I knew would work for him, and then I did, with some leftovers from a previous sock, I knit the heel using this formula that I've kind of figured out. It's not a super easy formula. It's a formula. I've been trying to come up with an easier formula, but I do think when I compare it to a sock that I know that fits him, I think this is going to work okay. It seems like, it's the same distance from heel to instep. I think it's going to work, but I didn't want to knit a whole pair of socks that I would have to rip out. So I thought I would send him a sample heel and see if that fits him first. So this is a pair of socks I started in January of 2021. It was the second pair of socks of the year. I had made a commitment to try not to hate toe-up sock knitting. I really love cuff down. And I developed that prejudice for toe-up knitting when I was a new sock knitter back in 2005. And I struggled with how to get started on the toe with a small number of stitches and doing increases. I was using DPNs, which normally I like, but starting with a few stitches was harder for me. And when I realized early on that I have fit issues across the heel diagonal. I have a very high arch, but I have kind of a small ankle. And so the number of stitches that I have available means that a lot of heels don't work well, like a peasant heel or a short row heel. And those types of heels can be done in either direction. Well, those heels didn't work for me. I could only use a heel flap and gusset, and I couldn't find good instructions for modifying heel flap and gusset socks that were done toe up. Nowadays, 15, 16, 17 years later, there's lots of information, and I've knit hundreds of pairs of socks, so I know a lot about fit and construction, and I don't really have trouble getting a sock that fits. I wanted to try toe-up socks again just to see if I could find a reason why I would want to knit socks toe-up. I want to find like a compelling reason to do it. Just like with sweaters, I prefer bottom-up flat in pieces and seaming, but I will knit top-down seamless construction if there's a very specific good reason why that sweater would be best suited for that construction. So that was the same idea with this. The first sock I did had a type of toe that you couldn't do cuff down, so that was a good reason to do that one toe up. So for this one, I wanted to try a new type of heel. And this is a heel that can be done cuff down as well, but I had never done it before, so I thought this is a good opportunity to learn it and to try it out. I also wanted to try experiment with hybrid construction. So what I did was, and I wanted to have two colors. I wanted a red for the cuff and the toe. So what I did was a provisional cast on here, and I worked the red toe first, going in that direction, because I really prefer the look of decreases to the look of increases. I mean, I'll do that. I'll do the increases. It's easier to start here and do increases and just shift the color than it is to do a provisional cast on, work that way, reattach, and go back the other way. But I wanted to try it. And what I did here was a type of heel that's called a mock short row heel. You get the same kind of shaping that you get with a regular short row heel, but instead of working short rows, what you are doing is you are working back and forth and you're decreasing so that you end up with a piece of fabric that's actually shaped like this, like has edges. And so then when you're doing the second half of the heel, as you come across, you're picking up a stitch at the edge, you come across, you purl across, you pick up a stitch back and forth. So that's how you get the same shape that you would get with a regular short row heel, but you're not using short rows. So again, because I have fit issues, I knew that I would need a small gusset to give myself more stitches so that I could create a larger heel that would be longer and would be wider across the diagonal. So that's what this little triangular bit is right here. So that was fun to learn, and I did a video on that heel earlier last year. And then I just knit the sock straight up. So it's a new year. So I have started a new vintage sweater project. This is part of my long-term project to knit a sweater from every decade between the 1890s and the 1990s. And so this sweater that I just started is from the 1940s. So aside from being from a different decade than I have done previously, the other difference with this project is that I'm doing it in collaboration with Billy from Show and Tell Knitting. So when we first introduced this collaboration back in October, we had a conversation back then, and different parts of the conversation were on each of our channels. So I will link to that video down below. We initially picked two patterns that each had elements we really liked, and our plan, both of us had a plan to merge those two sweaters in some way. And so what was going to be fun to see was how we decided to blend those two patterns together. Initially, we were going to start the project in November. We chose our colors. We did segments on our channels about how we chose colors. My life completely changed for about a month and a half. Unexpectedly, my daughter came from the Netherlands. We went on a 10-day road trip and saw family for the holidays. It was like all kinds of things that were not what I expected. So I was delayed in getting started. Billy started maybe even a month ago, I'm not sure. So I finally got started, and we had a conversation this week about how we each go about figuring out how to knit the sweater ourselves. Because in this era, up to the end of the 1940s, any sweater pattern is going to be presented in one size. So it will tell you what the to fit size is, but typically won't tell you what the finished size is. So that is really typical for any pattern up to this point in time. You do start seeing stitch gauge mentioned in previous decades, like in the 1920s and 30s, you'll see what the stitch gauge is. Rarely will they give you row gauge. This Harlequin pattern does give row gauge. It's really important in terms of the stitch pattern because each repeat of that stitch pattern has to occur over a specific number of rows, and the idea is to time everything in a certain way so certain elements hit at certain places and you end up with a very specific length at the end. So they really need to tell you what the row gauge is, but they also gave us the finished dimensions in the length of the body as well as the sleeve seam. They don't give any information about any circumferences. So the first thing I do with these projects is I sit down and I look at the number of stitches they tell me to cast on, and I divide that by the stitch gauge. So if they're telling me cast on 112 stitches and I know that the gauge that they're giving is 7.5 stitches per inch, then I can figure out, well, how many inches is this sweater actually going to be when it's cast on? And so I go through the pattern and I just draw out the schematic as I go. So my original impression of the Harlequin sweater was that it was a very basic sweater. It looked like it probably had waist shaping, but it was hard to tell based on the way the model was posed. But I've done waist shaping before, that's nothing new. I really thought that boat neck was a simplistic way of doing a collar, and the more I read through the pattern, the more I realized there were things hidden in there that I didn't realize, and that there was more to learn from this sweater, knitting it close to how it was presented. So I chose to only go with the Harlequin and modify the Harlequin sweater itself. One of the things that I really thought was interesting was that although there is waist shaping at the sides, anytime you have shaping at the sides, they also have you do some shaping in a particular vertical line it's in line with the bust points. So you aren't doing 2 decreases, one at each edge, you are doing 4 decreases. And so it's creating more three-dimensional waist shaping than just having it at the side. So I had heard of this kind of shaping before. I'd even experimented with it on swatches, but I've never knit a sweater that actually used it. So I absolutely wanted to use that. Then as I saw how the shoulders were shaped, I thought initially maybe they didn't have shaping because of the boat neck. And then I saw how the neck treatment was actually done. I started to understand just all of the design elements much better. And I had to think about, well, maybe I do want to knit it as it's instructed, or how could I modify it and yet keep some of those processes for finishing off the neck. How can I do that? So I'll be talking about that in the coming weeks as I get to those sections of the sweater. But in the meantime, you can listen to my conversation with Billy about how we each approach doing the calculations and figuring out how we're going to knit our sweaters to fit us. And as well, I'll link to her channel where she will have an extended conversation. We talked about multiple topics that you won't see on my channel, and you might be interested in hearing us talk through all of those things, because we have quite a few different approaches to how we are working essentially this same sweater. So you are using the blue and white striped sweater as your guideline, correct?
Yes.
And that only comes in one size, right?
I think so, yes.
Yeah.
35 inch, if I remember correctly.
So did you draw a schematic of the original and then take a look at it and then decide how you were going to change that? Is that how you started out?
That's exactly what I did and what I have done in the past. So I can show you that. Just hang on a minute. Okay, so this is what I did. Where you see the olive green, that's the original stitch count as specified in the pattern. That pattern did not have the triangles on it. That was a navy and white color block sweater with padded shoulders, as opposed to the actual Harlequin, which had the triangles on it. So I grabbed the triangles. I made up my own triangle pattern, what I imagined it would be, because I never saw the other pattern, which Roxanne has. But I just superimposed triangles, enough of them to go the length that I needed on the body as well as on the sleeves. Where you see hot pink, that's what I added on to size it up to my size.
Oh, that's a really interesting idea.
Their neckline was short like that, but I needed more length up here to give me a bigger armhole than what they were going to do. So I extended it in this area, but also when I went to the sleeve, and by the way, their sleeve in that pattern ended where you see this pink line going across right here. That was the length of their sleeve. And yes, their sleeve was knit up straight to where the underarm would be. And then they start decreasing. But I was knitting a full sleeve. You know, I took this down to the length that I wanted, which I think is 8 triangles in length. I added on all that hot pink area. And I also moved the whole shoulder construction, the square at the top.
So what I do, I have this notebook with gridded paper. And so I go through the pattern and I look at, what their cast on number is and what their gauge is. And so I figure out how wide that is. And I, draw it according to the squares, so that I draw it based on the actual size of the original sweater. And this is something that had, the dimensions were changing in various ways. They only gave me what the bust size was. It was to fit 33 to 35 inch bust. And so the actual measurement turned out to be 34 inches. So I do this schematic that has the original sizing, and I wanted to look at how it's proportioned. I translated that to what measurements I actually wanted. And then I looked at the gauge that I have versus the gauge that they were using and figured out my stitch counts.
Similar.
Yeah. I mean, I think, there's a couple of ways you can approach it, but basically you need to know what size you want and what your gauge is so that you know how many stitches you need. That's and then how long do you want it to be from that point to the next point, and how long do you want it to be from there to there.
But both you and I want to know the original look, what the original pattern was going for, so that we can decide if we want to keep that or if we want to modify it.
It was finding those bust or the waist starts that made me go, oh, this is really interesting. There are a couple of things in this construction that weren't what I expected and are really interesting to me. And I want to try to figure out how to use those in this project in a way that will actually work for my body and for the modifications that I need to make in order for the sweater to fit me. But I do like your overlay thing. I think that's really interesting to be able to compare that. Thank you very much, Billy.
Pleasure.
And it's been fun. So we'll have to catch up at the end. I'm sure you'll be done with your sweater long before I will be done with mine. But once we both have ours done, we'll have to do a final video with us each wearing our sweaters.
I think so. That'll be our next stop.
So I am starting with the sleeve of this sweater, and basically I was wanting to convince myself that I was getting an accurate gauge. And so I thought, well, I'm going to knit the sleeve, which is basically just a giant rectangle. And by the time I get up to the third rectangle, I'll wash and block it, and then I will get an extremely accurate gauge measurement. And I'm glad I did that. My gauge is slightly tighter than I originally thought, which allows me to adjust some of the stitch counts I have in the areas that will be shaped. So I wasn't worried about the sleeve, since the sleeve is large enough in circumference down near the wrist that if it were a little smaller or a little bigger, it wouldn't matter. But now that I'm up at the underarm and I know exactly what my gauge is, I can adjust some of the work that I've done in my schematic in order to make sure that things are going to be exactly right. So I will be talking about the technique of intarsia. I'll be doing some technique videos in the coming month or so that show a couple of different ways of approaching intarsia. If you have any questions about intarsia or color block knitting, please leave those down in the comments and let me know what you would like to learn going forward. Some of you may be saying to yourselves as I'm talking about this 1940s sweater, hey Roxanne, whatever happened to that 1960s sweater? Well, that sweater was in a timeout for various time periods this past year, and finally in the fall I decided, you know what, I'm not even going to think about it for the rest of 2021. I'm going to save it for Finish It February. Today I want to talk a little bit about what Finish It February is, and you can decide if that sounds like something that you want to take part in either on your own or collectively within my Ravelry group, if you want to feel like you're part of a community going through this together. So Finish It February, the goal is to reduce your UFO pile. So a UFO is an unfinished object. So I'm not necessarily talking about your works in progress, although those certainly are unfinished and you can work on those in the month of February. You can work on whatever you want anytime you want. I have no say over that. But a UFO is really a work in hibernation. It's something that got shoved in a drawer, in a box, in a bag, in a bin, in the back of a closet. You may or may not be aware of its existence. You may know I have some UFOs, and you might know what some of them are, but you might not remember some of them. And so the goal is to reduce that pile. And the first step in reducing that pile is something that you can do without actually having to knit anything. What you do is first of all, you go through the house or your knitting room or wherever you keep your knitting projects. You get every knitting project bag, every bin, wherever all you've got your projects stored. You bring them all into one place and do not feel bad about yourself. I understand the feeling if you see all of that and it's way more than you thought. Prior to the first time I actually brought all of my unfinished things together in one spot, I would sometimes be aware that I was creeping past 10 UFOs and heading into the 15 UFO territory, and I would feel very uncomfortable about that. I'm the kind of person, I don't like to have a lot more of something than I need. So if I have a little bit more, that's okay. But the more I have, the more uncomfortable I feel. So I would feel uncomfortable about heading toward 15 UFOs. And the way I dealt with that in that time frame, and this might be something that works for you, is I would really want to start a new project. I really like to start new projects. And most of the people who have a lot of UFOs really like to start new projects. We enjoy starting new projects more than we like finishing projects. There's no problem with that. It's just the reality. So I would be feeling uncomfortable about having 15 UFOs. And so I would make a deal with myself. Before I cast on for a new project, I would finish up 2 little ones. Like maybe I just had a few ends to weave in on something, or maybe had to sew something up. So it's something pretty easy. So I could get 2 of those off my plate right away. And then I would let myself start a new small project that I could complete in one, over the course of a couple of days. So the goal was not to add anything to my UFO pile. So I would give myself that happiness factor of starting a new project, but I would also finish that one. And then before I started another new one, I would go address a couple more. So that worked for me when I was in this fantasy world that I only had about 15 projects max ever. The reality was when I pulled all of them out from storage that I had like 43 unfinished projects. And so you can imagine where if 15 projects made me feel uneasy, what my initial reaction was to finding out that I had more than 40. I really felt sick. But I immediately stopped and I thought, these are all started, which means they aren't going to take the same amount of time to finish as they would if I started them brand new. Also, some of these are things I haven't seen in years. I had totally forgotten about. There are a few things I didn't recognize at all. And so it would be like starting new projects, only it wouldn't take as much time. So I thought about that. That made me feel better. And so that was 2016. And I spent most of that year just kind of rotating through those projects and finishing as many as I could that year. That was something that I decided to do. I was not punishing myself. I was having a lot of fun. But the first thing I did before I started knitting on anything was go through each one of those. I would pick it up. Could I even identify what it was? There were a few things that were like, I obviously did this with crappy yarn. I was experimenting with something. I have no idea what this is. I abandon it. I don't care. Cut the yarn, pull the needles out, and hold it over the trash. Get rid of it. That project is done. So one of the things, just because this is my personality, I had 40-some projects. I wrote them all down. I wrote down every project there was. And then every time I threw one in the trash, I got to cross it off. And so I reduced my UFO pile without knitting anything. The next thing was I had a couple of things that were finished. The knitting was finished, but the finishing details weren't done. One of those was a baby hat with a rolled brim, and then there were all of these little garter stitch colored bits that were meant to be rolled up and turned into rosebuds or leaves and then sewn onto this hat. And I was like, there's no way I was going to have any kind of fun doing that. I didn't have a baby in mind when I knit it. My dental hygienist had told me about this hat. It was in a book that I happened to own. She was telling me how much fun she was having with it, and she was knitting tons of them for all the baby gifts that she was making. And so I went home and I did the knitting. The knitting was fun. I had no desire to do that finishing. So I also didn't want to throw this one out, because it was nice yarn and all the bits were done. I just didn't want to do the sewing. And I thought, my dental hygienist seemed to really love this project. I put it in a Ziploc bag. The next time I went to get my teeth cleaned, I started the conversation by saying, you can say no. Do you want this? It's that hat that you told me about, that you've done a million of them, but all the bits need to be sewn on. And I said again, you can say no. And she said, I think that would probably just take me about an evening to do. Sure, I'll take it. And so I gave it to her. So those were all things I could cross off my list without knitting anything. Then we got to the things where I looked at it and like, I am not going to enjoy knitting this. I don't care about the finished item. I don't want it. Maybe the yarn is nice, but I have no interest in spending any more time on this project. Now I didn't look at it by saying, oh my gosh, I spent 25 hours on this so far. I better finish it because otherwise I will have wasted all my time. No, you have spent 25 hours whether or not you spend any more time on it. So that's the sunk cost fallacy, the idea that, well, I already spent all this time. I should spend however much time it's going to take to finish it. Not if you aren't going to enjoy it. There is absolutely no reason on earth why you should spend any more time on something if you aren't going to enjoy it. You can't control how much time you did spend, but you can control how much time you spend going forward. And I would rather choose something that I would really enjoy knitting, because the whole point of knitting is that I get pleasure out of it. It's not a punishment. So for me, when I look at a project like that has knitting, and it might be perfectly fine looking fabric, I take the needles out and I return it to stash. I do not frog it and rewind it. I return it as it is to my stash. It is now available to be used at some point in the future. If I decide I would really like to use that yarn for something, then I will spend the time frogging it, rewinding it with the ball winder or whatever. But I'm not spending any more time on it now. So that goes to stash. It gets crossed off the list. Then you have some things where maybe you don't really, it's nice yarn, it's a nice project, but maybe somebody else would want to finish it. You don't want to rip it out, but you don't really even want the yarn, but it's nice yarn. What do you do with it? You can give it away. You could take it to Goodwill, bag it up. You could even put the pattern in it if you think somebody might want to finish it, give it to Goodwill. You could see if somebody in your local guild or knitting group would like to finish it, would like to have it. I've done that before where I've had a half finished sock and I didn't like the yarn and I just took the whole thing. Anybody want this? Oh yeah, I'll take it. And then there's another option, which is Corey Eichenberger from iRock Knits. She's a designer. She actually lives here in the Twin Cities. She, I think it was last year, started something called, I think it's called Knitting Exchange. And the idea is you have a UFO, you don't want to finish it, maybe somebody else would. I will leave links down below. She's Instagram and she's got a Ravelry group that's for this. So you might trade with somebody else, you might buy somebody else's project and they might buy yours. It can work any kind of way, but that's another way that you can get rid of something without doing any more knitting on it. So that's the pile of things that are like you want nothing more to do with it, you're not spending any more time on. You might come across something where absolutely you want to finish this. I love this. I can't wait to wear this. I absolutely want to finish that. That goes into the yay pile. So you know that you want to finish this. And then you'll have this pile of ambiguity. You're not really sure what you want to do with this. Maybe you really liked the fabric, you liked the design, but you realized halfway through that it was going to be way too small. And you can't bear to rip that out because it's so beautiful, but you really don't know what to do with it. You can leave it in the pile of ambiguity and decide what you want to do with it and just keep it in your pile of UFOs for dealing with at some point in the future. And you can do this with any kind of project, even if there wasn't a problem with it. It's just like you're not sure how you feel about it. That's the ambiguity pile. When I went through my 40-some, I had a handful of projects that I really wasn't sure. I just kept them at the bottom of the pile, and by the time I got to the end of the year, there were a couple of things that I knew that I just wasn't going to ever be interested in, and a couple others that I kept in the ambiguity pile. Now, if you had that situation where you love the fabric, it's beautiful, you don't want to return it to stash, you want to find some way to use that fabric. If you're the kind of person who can think that way, if you're the kind of person who can find a ball of yarn and go, oh, I'm going to make this with this yarn. Or you look at that unfinished sweater and say, ooh, that's going to make a great pillow for my couch. And first of all, you're going to enjoy making the pillow. And number two, you need a pillow for your couch. Then you could do something like that. I'm the kind of knitter who figures out what they want to knit and then chooses the materials. So I cannot look at that fabric and go, I'm going to turn this into a whatever, and I'm not going to turn it into a whatever just for the sake of turning it into something. So that isn't an approach that works for me, but I do like to leave my unfinished things as they are in case some point in the future I think, oh, that would be a really fun project. You know, these felted, you take a sweater and you felt it, and then you cut out the felted wool and you turn it into a pair of mittens. You know, that kind of idea I wouldn't be able to do if I didn't have that unfinished sweater in my yarn stash. So it just depends on the kind of person you are and how much room you have to store things. Only occasionally will I actually frog something and return it to my stash. Now, some people are going to want everything neat and tidy. That's going to make them feel better and feel satisfied to rip it all out and rewind the yarn and put it back in their stash. If that makes you feel better, then you should do that. I've only done that once, and it was because I loved the yarn and I had all these negative feelings associated with that unfinished project. And whenever I looked at it, I just got those feelings back. And so in that particular case, it felt wonderful for me to rip that out, steam the yarn, skein it back up, and put it back in my stash. So you have to deal with sort of your emotional feelings about these things and your willingness to spend time on something. So if you have a very large pile of UFOs, that will be your first step. Gather all of them, then do the 3 piles, the yay, the nay, and the pile of ambiguity. And then next week we can talk about how different ways that you can approach deciding what you're going to do for Finish It February. Now, if you're the kind of knitter who only has a couple of or 2 or 3 UFOs, you're not going to have to go through all of this yay, nay ambiguity. It'll be obvious to you whether or not you want to work on something and which one of those things, or if you can work on all of them, that you'll want to do in February. But for those of you who have a lot of UFOs, don't feel ashamed or guilty about it. Like I said, I had over 40. I know of people who probably have 100 or 150 UFOs. So this is a way to just figure out what it is, reclaim the space, get things cleared out so that you have room to start all new projects in 2022. Well, that's it for this week's Casual Friday. If you have any comments or questions about today's video or suggestions for videos you'd like to see in the future, you can leave those down in the comments below or join the discussion in my Ravelry group, Rocks. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you next week.